the heart of a foggy London night, a peculiar sight awaited the exhausted poor. Rows of men slumped over a horizontal rope. This wasn't a punishment, but a purchased sanctuary from the bitter streets. Join me as we analyze the structural mechanics of these rope beds, offering you a rhythmic and boring journey into the quietest corners of history. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter 1: The City That Never Truly Slept. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine London in the year 1850. Not the London of romantic postcards or heritage tourism brochures. Not the London of top hats and afternoon tea and gleaming carriages rolling past elegant Regency terraces. Imagine, instead, the London that existed just behind that gilded facade. The London that most of its own inhabitants actually lived in, suffered in, and died in. Imagine a city of nearly 3 million souls packed into a geography that had never been designed to hold them. A city that was expanding at a rate that no urban planner, no public health official, no social philosopher of the age had any real strategy to manage. A city that was, in almost every measurable sense, choking on its own success. The smell would reach you first. That is what every visitor who left a written account noted. The smell of Victorian London, which was not one smell but a composite of dozens, layered one upon another in a great olfactory assault that the city's residents had mostly ceased to notice, but that struck outsiders with the force of a physical blow. There was the smell of coal smoke, which hung over the city in a permanent grey-yellow canopy and settled on every surface, on windowsills, on collarbones, on the petals of whatever flowers dared to bloom in the parks of the wealthy. There was the smell of the Thames, which in the summer months of 1858 would become so overwhelmingly offensive that it drove members of Parliament from their riverside chambers and prompted the newspapers to call it, with a directness that the Victorian press occasionally achieved, the Great Stink. The Thames was, at this point in history, not merely a river but an open sewer, the receptacle for the waste of 3 million human bodies, for the outpourings of tanneries and slaughterhouses and chemical works, for the carcasses of horses dragged to the water's edge and left there. Beneath the coal smoke and the river stench, you would catch other layers. The sweetish, oppressive reek of the tallow chandlers who rendered animal fat into candles and soap. The sharp ammoniac tang of the horse dung that coated every street in a brown mulch that the crossing sweepers, many of them children, spent their days scraping away so that the boots of the respectable classes might remain clean. The yeasty warmth rolling out of the bakeries in the small hours of the morning. The rotten sweet smell of discarded vegetable matter from the market stalls of Covent Garden and Billingsgate. And underneath all of it, always, the smell of human bodies unwashed, overworked, pressed against one another in densities that the modern mind struggles to comprehend. Now, add the noise. Victorian London was extraordinarily loud. The iron-shod wheels of carts and carriages on cobblestone streets created a continuous grinding roar that one contemporary writer compared to standing inside a mill. Street traders announced their wares through the full range of their voices. The fish sellers, the rag-and-bone men, the sellers of watercress and hot chestnuts and old clothes, each with their own distinctive cry that echoed down the canyon-like streets. Church bells rang the hours from dozens of steeples. The great breweries and foundries and printing works that lined the riverbanks and occupied the spaces between residential streets sent vibrations through the ground that you could feel in your feet. At night, the noise diminished, but never entirely ceased. The city breathed more slowly in the dark hours, but it never stopped breathing. There were still the night soil men collecting the waste from the cesspits that the sewerage system had not yet reached. There were still the bakers and the newspaper compositors and the market porters who worked through the night to have their goods ready for the morning trade. There were still the footsteps and the voices of those, and there were very many of them, who had nowhere to sleep and spent the dark hours simply walking, keeping moving. because movement was warmer than stillness, and because the police would move you on if you stopped too long. This was the city into which the Industrial Revolution had delivered several 100,000 migrants over the preceding decades. Men and women from the rural counties of England, from the desperate poverty of Ireland, from Scotland and Wales, from the continent of Europe. All of them drawn by the promise of work in a city that was at once the wealthiest place on earth and one of the most brutally indifferent to the suffering of its poorest inhabitants. The factories and workshops and docks and building sites of London created enormous quantities of employment and also enormous quantities of unemployment, a tidal rhythm of labor demand that swelled in good seasons and contracted in bad ones, that collapsed overnight when a business failed or a trade slackened, leaving its workers not merely jobless but frequently homeless within days, since a man's ability to pay his rent was almost entirely dependent on his ability to work, and the margin between the two was vanishingly thin. Consider the arithmetic of survival as it presented itself to a laboring man in mid-Victorian London. An unskilled laborer, a dock worker, say, or a building laborer, might earn, in a good week, when work was plentiful, somewhere between 10 and 15 shillings. A furnished room in a respectable working-class lodging house cost perhaps 2 to 3 shillings a week. Food, bread, potatoes, occasional scraps of meat, cost another several shillings. Fuel for heating and cooking, clothing, the inevitable penny or two that went on a mug of beer or gin at the end of a long day. By the time all of this was accounted for, there was very little margin remaining, and no margin at all against the emergencies that Victorian working-class life served up with monotonous regularity. A week of illness, a period of bad weather that shut down the building sites, a change in the season that reduced demand for casual labor at the docks, a bereavement that required the payment of burial costs, because the Victorians were deeply, almost obsessively committed to the idea of a proper funeral, even in the direst poverty. Any one of these could tip a family from the precarious stability of a rented room into arrears, and from arrears into eviction, and from eviction into the street in a matter of weeks. And the street, in Victorian London, was not a metaphor. It was a literal destination. It was where people actually went when the last option closed. The city's streets, its archways and doorways, the spaces beneath its bridges, the steps of its churches, the covered market stalls of its trading districts. These were the sleeping places of perhaps tens of thousands of Londoners on any given night. Charles Dickens, who walked the streets of London obsessively and at all hours, and who wrote about what he saw with a journalist's precision as well as a novelist's feeling, estimated in his journalism of the 1850s that on a cold winter's night he could count hundreds of sleeping figures within a short radius of the Strand alone, men, women, and children, huddled in every available sheltered corner. Some wrapped in rags, some with nothing at all between their bodies and the cold stone. It was against this landscape, this vast, churning, indifferent, magnificent, terrible city, that the institution we are going to explore in this series existed. The rope house, the penny hang, the twopenny hangover. It went by various names, and it occupied a very specific rung on the ladder of Victorian destitution, not the very bottom, which was the open street, but close enough to it to feel the cold breath of that particular abyss. For twopence, or sometimes a penny, a person could buy themselves a night's sleep in one of these establishments. Not a bed, not a bunk, not even a strip of floor, but a length of rope strung at chest height across a room, over which they could drape their arms and lean their weight, and, in the small hours before dawn, achieve something that the body recognized, however grudgingly, as rest. It sounds, on first hearing, like something from a fairy tale, or from a nightmare. It sounds like the kind of detail that a Victorian novelist might invent to make a point about the cruelties of industrial capitalism. In fact, it was entirely real. It was documented by journalists and social investigators, described in parliamentary reports, depicted in the illustrated press. Henry Mayhew wrote about it. James Greenwood wrote about it. The Salvation Army's early workers wrote about it. It existed, in various forms, from at least the early decades of the 19th century through to the beginning of the 20th, when the combined forces of municipal reform, philanthropic investment, and changing social attitudes slowly caused it to disappear. The question this series sets out to answer is not simply did this happen, because it did, but why did this happen? What were the forces, economic, political, social, architectural, that created a city in which tens of thousands of people could find no better place to sleep than a rope? What did it feel like to be one of those people? Who were they, in their individuality and their particularity, beyond the abstract category of the poor that the Victorians used to contain and distance themselves from the problem? And what, if anything, did the existence of the rope house ultimately change in terms of public consciousness, in terms of policy, in terms of the long, slow, still incomplete project of ensuring that every human being in a city has somewhere to lay their head at night? We will follow that story through 12 chapters, moving from the broad panorama of Victorian London's social geography down to the intimate detail of a single night in a single room, and then back out again to the wider world of reform and response. We will let the Victorian Londoners who wrote about these things speak as much as possible in their own words, because they were, many of them, extraordinarily vivid writers, and because their words carry a weight of direct witness that no paraphrase can quite replicate. But for now, as we begin, let the city settle around us. Feel the cobblestones underfoot, still warm from the day's traffic. Watch the gas lamps bloom into life as the lamplighter makes his rounds, trailing his long pole. Listen to the thousand voices of the street as the evening trade thickens and the working day extends, for those who have work, into the blue hour of dusk. And notice, at the edge of your vision there, in the doorway of a narrow court, turning off the main thoroughfare into the dark, the figure of a man who is not heading home because he has no home to head to, and who is calculating, quietly and without self-pity, what the pennies in his coat pocket will be enough for tonight. He is the reason we are here. Chapter 2. The Poverty Ladder. Understanding the ranks of the poor. One of the things that the Victorians understood about poverty, and that their most perceptive social investigators tried, with considerable difficulty, to communicate to comfortable middle-class readers, was that it was not a single condition. It was a spectrum. It was a ladder, or perhaps more accurately, a descending staircase, each step of which represented a distinct and recognizable mode of life with its own geography, its own economy, its own social codes, its own relationship to the city and to the people above and below it on the scale. To understand the rope house, to understand why it existed and who it served, you first need to understand where it sat within this larger architecture of deprivation, and what lay above it and below it on that long descending stair. At the top of the ladder, if we begin our descent from the upper reaches of the working class, rather than from the comfortable middle, we would find the skilled artisans and tradesmen, the carpenters, the compositors, the engineers, the tailors, who formed what historians would later call the labour aristocracy of Victorian Britain. These were men who earned regular wages, who belonged to trade unions that offered some protection against the vicissitudes of the market, who lived in clean terraced houses in the more respectable working-class districts of the city, Islington, Bermondsey, Hackney, and who maintained a domestic life that, in its aspiration to order and cleanliness and respectability, mirrored, at a lower economic altitude, the domestic ideal of the middle classes themselves. Their wives did not work outside the home if it could be avoided. Their children went to school. They read newspapers and attended chapel and kept a small piece of garden if one was available. They were, in their own estimation, and in the estimation of those above them, the deserving poor, a category that carried enormous moral weight in the Victorian imagination, and that distinguished the respectable working man from the chaotic and feckless poor below. Below the skilled artisan came the semi-skilled and the unskilled labourer, a vast category encompassing an enormous range of trades and conditions, from the steadily employed factory hand who had a regular job and a regular wage, through to the casual labourer whose employment was daily, uncertain, and dependent on the whims of the market and the season. This is the crucial stratum for our story, because it is from here that the descent towards the rope house most commonly began. The casual labourer in Victorian London ran on casual labour, in the docks, in the building trade, in the market portering, in the scores of small workshops and sweatshops that produced the garments and furniture and printed matter and consumer goods of the world's largest city, lived without the security of a regular wage, and therefore without the security of any forward planning whatsoever. He could not sign a year's lease on a house. He could barely commit to a week's rent. His life was lived in the perpetual present tense of the next day's work and the next day's pay. For the casual labourer and his family, the dominant form of housing was the furnished room, not an apartment, not a house, but a single room. Sometimes a single corner of a room divided from its neighbours by a curtain or a partition of thin boards, rented by the week or even by the night from a landlord who was himself often only marginally wealthier than his tenants. The great rookeries and courts and warrens of Victorian London, St Giles, the Nickel in Bethnal Green, Jacob's Island in Bermondsey, the Seven Dials district near Covent Garden, were dense networks of such accommodation, where houses built for single families in an earlier century had been subdivided and subdivided again until they contained a dozen families or more, each in their single room, sharing a staircase and a yard and, perhaps, a single standpipe for water. The conditions in these places were, by any modern standard, extraordinary. Charles Dickens described Jacob's Island, the setting he chose for Bill Sykes's Death in Oliver Twist, as a place where the houses overhung the water on rotting wooden piles, where the mud below was black with the accumulated filth of decades, where the rooms were so damp that the wallpaper hung in strips and mushrooms grew in the corners. The social investigator Andrew Mearns, in his 1883 pamphlet The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, described entering rooms in which entire families lived, cooked, slept, gave birth, and died, that were so dark and airless and saturated with human effluence that he struggled to breathe. He described, with a precision that reads as clinical horror, the sight of a single room in which a family of 5 shared the available floor space with the decomposing body of a dead family member, the family unable to afford the burial costs necessary to remove it. A furnished room in one of these districts cost, in the mid-Victorian period, between £1 and £2 a week for the most basic accommodation, a price that sounds almost negligibly small until you measure it against the incomes involved and the brutal arithmetic of survival that the casual labourer faced. For a man earning perhaps 8 or 10 shillings a week in a good week, and nothing at all in a bad one, the rent of even a single room represented a substantial proportion of his income, and any interruption to his earnings immediately threatened his ability to meet it. Landlords in these districts were not, in the main, patient creditors. They operated on margins almost as thin as their tenants, and they could not afford to carry unpaid rent for more than a week or two before evicting the defaulter and finding a new occupant. The result was a constant churn in movement of people. Families evicted from rooms, moving to cheaper rooms, evicted from those, moving to the common lodging house, moving on again as their resources dwindled further. The common lodging house, the doss house, represented the next step down the staircase, and it is worth pausing on it because it is the immediate precursor of the rope house and the institution that most immediately contextualizes it. The common lodging house was a commercially operated establishment, regulated from 1851 onwards under a series of Acts of Parliament that attempted, with mixed success, to impose minimum standards of cleanliness and ventilation. In exchange for a fee, typically 2p to 4p a night, the lodger received a bed, or a share of a bed, or a bunk in a dormitory room, together with the use of a common kitchen where he might cook whatever food he had managed to acquire during the day. The quality of these establishments varied enormously. At the better end, the model lodging houses promoted by Victorian reformers offered clean dormitories, adequate ventilation, hot water, and a degree of order and supervision. At the worse end, and the worse end was far more common, they were crowded, filthy, verminous, and in some cases openly criminal, functioning as gathering places for thieves and prostitutes and receivers of stolen goods, governed by their own rough internal hierarchies and their own codes of behavior. What the common lodging house offered, even at its worst, was horizontal rest, the ability to lie down. And lying down, as any human body knows in its deepest biological understanding, is fundamentally different from any upright or seated alternative. The body needs to lie flat to achieve the deeper stages of sleep. The restorative sleep that consolidates memory and repairs tissue and regulates the systems that keep a person functional. To sleep upright, as the rope house required, was to sleep in a way that the body accepted only because it had no other choice. A partial sleep, a sleep that rested without fully restoring, that kept a person alive without quite keeping them well. Below the common lodging house on the descending staircase came a range of options that occupied the grey territory between the last commercial shelter and the open street. There was the low lodging house, establishments that operated below the minimum standards required by law, illegally overcrowded, sometimes licensing their floor space by the square foot rather than the bed. There was the deputy house, where a woman known as the deputy would rent out places on the floor of her single room for a halfpenny or a penny. There was the casual ward of the workhouse, the spike, in the vocabulary of the street, where a destitute person could, in theory, present themselves and receive a night's shelter and a meal in exchange for a morning's labor. though, as we will explore in a later chapter, the conditions and the rules attached to this option made it deeply unappealing to many who might otherwise have used it. There was the night refuge run by charitable organizations, of which there were a growing number by the mid-Victorian period, each with its own rules about who might enter and on what terms. And then, below all of these, at the very bottom of the commercial sleep market, just above the absolute zero of the open street, there was the rope house. The rope house served those for whom even the cheapest regular bed was beyond reach. It served those who had been reduced, by whatever combination of circumstances, to the possession of a single penny or tuppence, and nothing more. It served, in other words, those who were not at the bottom of the poverty ladder, who had not yet surrendered to the complete destitution of the doorstep or the embankment, but who were close enough to feel it. It served people who were still, in some meaningful sense, participants in the commercial economy of the city, still able to earn or beg or find the 1 or 2 pennies that the rope house required, but who had no access to any more expensive option. This is a crucial point, and it is one that the Victorian social investigators grasped with admirable clarity. The person who slept on the rope was not, typically, the person who had given up entirely. They were the person who was still trying, still fighting, in the grim daily struggle of Victorian destitution, to stay one step above the absolute bottom. The penny or tuppence paid to the rope housekeeper was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign of effort, of will, of the determination to remain within the orbit of shelter and shelter's protections, rather than to sink into the complete vulnerability of the street. There was, among the people who used rope houses, a clear awareness of the distinctions that separated them from those below, a pride in those distinctions that might seem paradoxical from the outside, but that made perfect psychological sense from the inside, as one of the only forms of dignity available. Understanding this, understanding that the rope house was not an aberration or an outlier, but a logical and indeed necessary feature of Victorian London's poverty landscape, occupying a specific ecological niche in the hierarchy of urban destitution, is the beginning of understanding what the rope house really was and what it really meant. It was not a curiosity. It was not a cruel joke. It was a solution, inadequate, uncomfortable, degrading by any humane measure, but a solution nonetheless, to a problem that the city had created and that the city had not yet found any better answer for. It was the last commercially viable response to the question that several 100,000 Londoners were asking every evening as the light faded and the temperature dropped. Where do I sleep tonight? The answer, for those with 1 or 2 pennies and nothing more, was, lean on the rope. Close your eyes. Try not to think about tomorrow. The attendant will let you know when morning comes. Chapter 3: The Penny Sit and the Common Lodging House. Before we descend to the rope, we need to spend time in the establishment that sat just above it, on the ladder of Victorian night shelters, the common lodging house, the doss house, the padding ken in the vocabulary of the street. Because the common lodging house was not merely the context for the rope house, it was its immediate precursor, the institution against which the rope house defined itself, and the world from which the rope house drew many of its clients on those nights when even the few pennies required for a bunk or a shared bed could not be found. To understand one, you need to understand the other, and to understand both, you need to step inside and look around. The common lodging house was a fixture of Victorian urban life in a way that is difficult to fully convey to a modern reader. By the 1850s, London alone had well over 1,000 of them, housing on any given night perhaps 30,000 people, a city within a city, operating by its own rules, serving a population that was almost entirely invisible to the respectable classes unless they were specifically looking for it, as a growing number of reformers, journalists, and clergymen were beginning to do. They were concentrated in specific districts, in the courts and alleys off the Strand, in the Whitechapel and Spitalfields areas of the East End, in the Southwark and Bermondsey districts south of the river, in the St Giles district near the British Museum that had been notorious as a rookery since at least the 18th century, but they existed, in smaller numbers, throughout the metropolitan area. Wherever the concentration of poverty and the absence of other housing options created a market for very cheap overnight accommodation, a common lodging house occupied, typically, a building that had once served a different purpose, a former private house, subdivided and reorganized for commercial use, or in some cases a building that had been purpose-built for the trade. Though this was less common before the later Victorian period, when philanthropic building programs began to create model alternatives. The ground floor usually contained the kitchen, the central social space of the establishment, a large room with a fire or a range, where residents cooked whatever food they possessed, where they dried their clothes, where they gathered in the evenings to talk and argue and play cards, and do whatever other things the long dark hours of Victorian urban poverty required by way of distraction and human contact. Above the kitchen, the upper floors were given over to sleeping accommodation, dormitory rooms lined with bunks or wooden sleeping platforms, sometimes with individual mattresses that might charitably be described with slachably slackages, sometimes by sometimes with sometimes sensac, sometimes and in rethan ruin bank and where the of quill at the grip up fast that what with up of you the pipe was about that of the what would that fit over pads was a cat quite up if the cat was this quick at the best school did it looks the fellows don't look with perspective with The mattress question is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it was both a practical concern and a symbolic one. A proper mattress, even the thin, lumpy, verminous article that passed for one in the cheaper lodging houses, represented a considerable investment for the house's proprietor, and maintaining it in any kind of sanitary condition was essentially impossible given the volume and turnover of the clientele. The result was that the cheaper establishments either did not bother with individual mattresses at all, offering instead a shared sleeping platform covered with sacking, or maintained mattresses in a condition that the more fastidious lodgers, and even among the destitute there were gradations of fastidiousness, found deeply unappealing. Henry Mayhew, in his investigations of the 1840s and 1850s, describes mattresses that were so heavily infested with vermin that they seemed to move of their own accord, and lodgers who preferred to sleep on the floor or on the wooden boards of the sleeping platform rather than on what the mattress had to offer rather than what the mattress had to baff off with the mattress had to offer what to math or what to math with the mac with wick up with the me with the plop with plom with the quither with good with this swell with with will house mask Mikak with knop with dap with my bad pa or that with it with that where back with that bad that wolf what I will go after work what the back ask bed with the kaka that's was the best bit that's good off it's me this but still this the full spiel at The bedbug was the constant companion of the Victorian lodging house, and indeed of Victorian working-class housing more generally. It was not a sign of unusual squalor, but of universal condition. The cities of the Victorian era, with their densely packed housing, their limited access to clean water, and their complete ignorance of the germ theory of disease, were ideal environments for parasitic insects of all kinds, and the lodging house, with its constant rotation of new bodies and its near impossibility of thorough cleaning, was ideal for the bedbug in particular. Contemporary accounts of life in lodging houses mention bugs with a casualness that reflects how entirely routine their presence was. They were an accepted irritant, like the rain or the noise of the street, something that you managed as best you could and otherwise simply endured. The economics of the lodging house were, in principle, straightforward. The proprietor charged each lodger a nightly fee, ranging from about twopence in the very cheapest establishments to fourpence or sixpence in the better ones, and from this income covered the cost of the building's rent, fuel for the kitchen fire, candles or oil for lighting, and whatever other running costs the business required. The profit margin was thin, and the most successful operators were those who maximized occupancy, filling every available bunk, every corner of floor space, every inch of the building, and minimized expenditure on maintenance and cleaning. This created a structural incentive towards exactly the conditions that reformers found most horrifying: overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate sanitation, and the complete impossibility of any real cleanliness in a building through which hundreds of people passed every week. The Lodging Houses Act of 1851, promoted by Lord Shaftesbury, and enacted as part of a broader legislative effort to address urban overcrowding and public health, represented the first serious attempt by the state to regulate these establishments. It required common lodging houses to register with the local authority and to meet minimum standards of space per occupant. ventilation, and sanitation. The local police were empowered to inspect registered establishments and to close those that failed to meet the standards. It was, in principle, a significant piece of legislation. In practice, its enforcement was variable, and its impact on the worst establishments limited by the limited resources available for inspection and by the ability of the more unscrupulous operators to maintain the appearance of compliance while continuing the realities of overcrowding. But it did create a framework, and it established the principle important for later developments, that the state had a legitimate interest in and responsibility for the conditions under which the poorest inhabitants of its cities slept. Within the lodging house, life had its own rhythms and rituals. The kitchen fire was the heart of the establishment, and around it the lodgers gathered each evening in a scene that observers consistently described as possessing a strange, smoky suitability. Mayhew wrote about the lodging house kitchen with the fascinated attention he brought to all the social formations of the street poor, noting the way in which hierarchies formed and were observed, the way in which certain regular lodgers established territories and routines, the way in which information circulated and alliances formed among people who might share a roof for only a single night and never meet again. There was, he noted, a great deal of talk about work prospects, about the police, about the relative merits of different establishments, about the news of the streets and the markets and the courts. There was storytelling. There was, quite often, singing. There was the kind of fierce, ribald, occasionally violent social life that forms wherever human beings are compressed together in confined spaces and stripped of most of the other resources that normally structure their social existence. The kitchen was also where food was prepared, and more importantly for those who had no food, where it might sometimes be obtained or shared. The social economy of the lodging house kitchen had its own conventions around food, about the sharing or not sharing of cooking pots, about the obligations created by the gift of a portion of food, about the status implications of what a person ate and how they cooked it. Mayhew describes a man frying a piece of fish on the end of a stick, having no pan to cook in and no money to buy one, and doing so with a dignity that struck the journalist as both admirable and heartbreaking. He describes others eating raw vegetables, or bread so old it had hardened to something approaching wood, or nothing at all, sitting at the kitchen table in the warmth of the fire with empty hands, waiting for something to change. The rules of the common lodging house, as they were codified by more respectable establishments and by the requirements of the 1851 Act, included provisions for the separation of the sexes in sleeping quarters, a provision that was, in the less reputable establishments, honored largely in the breach. The mixing of men and women in the sleeping rooms of the worst lodging houses was a source of particular horror to Victorian reformers, who saw in it the potential for, and the actuality of, a range of moral disasters. Prostitution was widely assumed to be common in the promiscuous darkness of the mixed dormitories, though the evidence suggests that the reality was often more complicated, that what occurred was less often the commercial exchange of the streetwalker than the desperate and sometimes tender improvisation of people who were living so close to the edge that the ordinary categories of respectable behavior had ceased to have much operational relevance. Children were everywhere in these establishments, and their presence was perhaps the detail that most disturbed middle-class observers. Children sleeping in dormitories alongside adult strangers. Children in the kitchen at all hours, warming themselves at the fire, picking up whatever information the adults around them were transmitting. Children developing, from earliest youth, the complete familiarity with destitution and its customs that the street required. James Greenwood, the journalist who spent a night in a Lambeth casual ward in 1866 and wrote about it in a series of articles for the Pall Mall Gazette that caused a national sensation, described a boy of perhaps 12 whom he encountered in the lodging house kitchen on his way to the workhouse, a boy who spoke with the authority and world-weariness of someone who had been navigating these institutions since he could walk, who knew the rules of every doss-house within a mile and the personality of every deputy, who carried his poverty with a matter-of-factness that was more disturbing, in its way, than any amount of visible suffering would have been. It was from this world, the world of the lodging house kitchen. The shared bunk, the verminous mattress, the smoky fire, the strange fellowship of the destitute, that the rope house drew its clientele. When a man or woman had the twopence or fourpence for a lodging house bunk, they slept there. When they did not, when the day's work had yielded nothing, or the begging had failed, or the last few coins had gone on bread, and there was nothing left for shelter, they faced a choice: the open street, the workhouse casual ward, with all its conditions and humiliations, or, if they had 1 or 2 pennies remaining, the rope house, the next step down on the descending staircase, the last commercial option before the city's cold and indifferent exterior claimed them entirely. It is to that establishment, its architecture, its economics, its clientele, and its strange nocturnal life, that we now turn. Chapter 4. The Twopenny Hangover. Rope Houses Explained. Let us be precise about what a rope house actually was, because precision is both possible and important here, and because the reality, when you understand it fully, is in some ways more remarkable than the half-formed impression that the phrase "sleeping on a rope" initially conjures. A rope house, known variously as a penny hang, a twopenny hang, a twopenny rope, or in some contemporary accounts, simply as a hang, was a commercial establishment that offered overnight shelter of a particular and specific kind. The physical arrangement was as follows. In a room, sometimes a single room, sometimes several rooms, on different floors of a building, a series of ropes or stout cords were strung horizontally across the space, at approximately chest or shoulder height, running parallel to one another with a gap of perhaps 18 inches to 2 feet between them. These ropes were fixed to posts or to the walls at either end, taut enough to bear weight, and they ran the length of the room in parallel rows, creating a kind of open grid of lines at standing height. The lodger, having paid his penny or twopence at the door, would take his place at one of these ropes and lean over it, resting his arms and upper body on the cord, allowing it to bear the forward lean of his weight. In this posture, bent forward at the waist, arms draped over the rope, chin sinking towards the chest, he would attempt to sleep. The rope supported him in the sense that it prevented him from falling forward onto his face. It allowed him to release enough muscular tension that the body could achieve something approximating rest. But it was rest of a profoundly compromised kind. The body remained upright. The spine remained in a stressed position. The deeper stages of sleep, the slow wave sleep and the REM sleep that are associated with genuine physical and cognitive restoration, were, if not entirely impossible, then significantly harder to achieve in this posture than in any form of recumbency. The room would be filled, on a busy night, with dozens of figures in this hunched posture, a sight that contemporary observers described with a variety of emotional registers, from the pitying to the horrified to the grimly satirical. Henry Mayhew, who visited a number of these establishments in the course of his investigations in the late 1840s, described entering a rope house in the Whitechapel area and finding the room already full by 9 in the evening. The sleepers, if sleepers they could be called, were arranged in rows, each leaning over his rope in the same attitude of exhausted submission, their breathing heavy and irregular, the room thick with the exhalations of so many bodies, the only light a single tallow candle that threw more shadow than illumination. It is one of the most vivid descriptions in a body of work that is full of vivid descriptions, and it lodges in the memory precisely because it refuses to sentimentalize what it is seeing while also refusing to look away from it. The rope or cord used in these establishments was typically of a substantial diameter, thick enough to bear weight without cutting into the arms of those leaning on it, though contemporary accounts do mention the discomfort caused by the pressure of the rope on unpadded forearms over the course of a long night. In some establishments, the rope was covered with sacking or rough cloth to reduce the discomfort. In others, no such accommodation was made. The physical toll of a night spent on the rope, the aching shoulders, the stiff neck, the marks left on the arms by the cord's pressure, was part of the package, accepted without comment by those who had no alternative. The management of the rope house was a commercial operation like any other, and it had its own particular operational logic. The proprietor, often referred to in contemporary accounts as the keeper, charged the entrance fee at the door, typically in advance, as was standard practice in the lodging trade generally. The room might open for business at dusk, or even earlier in the winter months, when the cold drove people to seek shelter earlier in the day, and it would fill gradually through the evening hours as people returned from their day's work or wandering and counted what remained in their pockets. A rope house that charged a penny might accommodate 50 or 60 or even more people in a large room. At twopence, the numbers might be somewhat smaller, both because the higher price excluded a portion of the potential clientele, and because the slightly more respectable clientele tended to be slightly less tolerant of extreme overcrowding. The morning routine of the rope house was the detail that captured most sharply the imagination of Victorian journalists and reformers, and it is the detail that has most persistently attached itself to the institution in historical memory. At a time appointed by the keeper, typically at first light, or at 5 or 6 in the morning, an attendant would go to the rope and, without ceremony or warning, cut it or unfasten it from one of its anchor points. The effect was immediate and uniform. Every person leaning against the rope lost their support simultaneously and lurched or stumbled forward into sudden, ungainly wakefulness. The image of a room full of people jerking abruptly into consciousness at the sudden loss of the rope beneath their arms. The startled, bewildered expressions, the stiff and aching bodies, the slow recognition of where they were and what had happened was the detail that Victorian writers reached for most often when they wanted to convey the particular indignity of the rope house. Its absolute and unambiguous position at the very edge of what commerce was willing to provide in exchange for human money. There is something almost theatrical about this morning routine. The cutting of the rope as a kind of curtain drop, the simultaneity of the awakening, the democratic equality of the stumble. And it is perhaps for this reason that it recurs so consistently in the accounts. It made for a vivid image, but it is worth noting that the accounts are not entirely consistent on this point. Some describe the rope being cut. Others describe it being lowered or unfastened at one end so that it drooped to the floor gradually rather than collapsing all at once. Some accounts suggest that the morning rousing was less dramatic than the cutting narrative implies, that the keeper simply walked through the room calling time, as any lodging house keeper would, and that the rope was released as part of the general procedure of clearing the room for the next day's business. The truth is probably that practice varied from establishment to establishment, and that the more dramatic version, the simultaneous cut and collapse, was, if not universal, then at least common enough to have become the defining image of the institution. Where were these establishments located? The evidence drawn from Mayhew's accounts, from police records, from the reports of charitable organizations, and from the occasional mention in newspaper journalism, suggests that rope houses were concentrated in the same areas of London that concentrated the worst poverty and the largest populations of casual labourers and street poor. Whitechapel and Spitalfields in the East End, the Southwark and Borough areas south of the river, the districts around the major railway termini that were magnets for migrants and travellers, the areas near the docks where casual labour was concentrated. They were not, in general, the kind of establishment that advertised itself or sought public attention. They were businesses that served a specific and easily identified clientele and that relied on local knowledge rather than any form of marketing to fill their rooms each night. The pricing structure of the rope house, typically a penny or tuppence, placed it in a very specific relationship to the broader economy of Victorian poverty. A penny in the 1850s was not nothing. It represented, depending on the trade and the season, perhaps an hour of unskilled labor, or the cost of a chunk of bread substantial enough to constitute a meal. But it was also an amount that could plausibly be found, or begged, or earned by a few minutes of street trading, by the sale of a small quantity of found or salvaged material, by any of the dozens of microeconomic transactions through which the street poor supplemented whatever formal wages they might occasionally earn. The rope house was, in this sense, calibrated almost perfectly to the margins of what the street economy could produce on a bad day, enough to offer shelter to those who had almost nothing, while remaining a commercial operation that needed to turn a profit. How profitable was the rope house business? The economics, when you work them through, are revealing. Room containing, say, 40 rope spaces, each charged at tuppence, would generate 6 shillings and 8 pence per night in gross revenue. Against this, the keeper needed to set the rent of the building, the cost of fuel for whatever heating the room provided, the wages of any attendants, and the cost of the candles or oil lamps that provided minimal lighting. In a city where building rents in the poorer districts could be relatively low, and where the other running costs of a rope house were minimal, the ropes themselves required little maintenance. There was no bedding to launder, no mattresses to replace. It is possible that the operation could turn a modest profit on these numbers. But the margins were thin, and the business was subject to the same fluctuations as every other service that depended on the income of the casual poor. A run of cold, wet weather that kept laborers from working, or a sudden downturn in the casual labor market, could empty a rope house as quickly as it casual labor market could empty a rope sledge at a ropatiati. Clitiat a rope of a quakiat a quackliat clee it clickliat it clackliat it cliplan will it cleat black heavy with him with kem of ways on with as that as wexak with the hat put out a pass a pepper I put web a cat a hop at the like a wife golf go crowd of work up pif will guess good to meet mask wo about with the staples What the rope house did not provide, and what any honest account of it must acknowledge, was any genuine sense of security or comfort. The word shelter covers a spectrum from the barest protection from the elements to something approaching domestic comfort, and the rope house sat at the absolute minimum of that spectrum. It kept the rain off. It provided some degree of warmth. A room full of bodies generates heat, and even the minimal structure of a building provides insulation against the cold that the open street does not. It provided, in some sense, community, the company of other human beings, however miserable, which is preferable to the absolute solitude of the doorstep. But it provided no horizontal rest, no real privacy, no security for whatever possessions a person might carry, no morning meal, no ability to wash or to attend to any of the other functions of the body that require a degree of privacy and facility that the rope house simply did not offer. And yet people chose it, night after night, hundreds of people across London, and this institution was by no means confined to London. Similar arrangements have been documented in Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and other major Victorian cities chose the rope house over the alternatives. They chose it over the open street because the open street was colder and more dangerous. They chose it over the workhouse casual ward because the workhouse required the surrender of liberty, of clothing, of the ability to leave in the morning when and as one chose. They chose it because it cost only what they had, and because what they had was very little, and because the rope house was precisely calibrated to serve those for whom very little was all there was. That calibration, that almost architectural fit between the institution and the economic niche it occupied, is what makes it so revealing of the society that produced it. The rope house did not exist, despite Victorian capitalism. It existed because of it, as one of the necessary consequences of an economic system that generated enormous wealth and enormous destitution in equal and simultaneous measure, and that left the management of the latter almost entirely to commerce and charity, rather than to the state. Chapter 5. The Men and Women of the Rope. Who were they? It is easy, when examining historical poverty, to fall into the trap of treating the poor as a category rather than as a collection of individuals, to speak of the destitute or the street poor in ways that smooth away the particularity of individual lives and replace it with a convenient abstraction. The Victorians were not immune to this tendency. Indeed, the language of Victorian social investigation, its talk of classes and types and conditions, sometimes actively encouraged it. But the best of the Victorian social investigators, Mayhew, above all, resisted the abstraction and insisted on the individual, returning again and again to the specific person, the specific voice, the specific history, in ways that preserved something of the humanity of those they were documenting, even as they inevitably shaped and mediated it for a middle-class readership. In the spirit of that insistence, this chapter attempts to answer the question that gives it its title. Who were the men and women who slept on the rope? Not as a type, not as an abstraction, but as individuals, or as close to individuals as the surviving record allows us to get. The evidence is fragmentary. The people who used rope houses were not, in the main, people whose lives generated documents, and the accounts that do exist are filtered through the perceptions of observers who came from very different worlds. But there is enough, if you read carefully and contextualize generously, to begin to build up a picture. The largest single group among rope house users, by virtually every account, was men who had fallen out of regular employment, not men who had never worked, but men who had worked and lost their work, or who worked intermittently in trades that the casual labor market made perpetually insecure. The dock laborer was the paradigmatic figure here, the man who presented himself each morning at the dock gates, alongside scores of other men, in the hope of being selected for a day's work unloading ships, and who, if not selected, had the entire day to fill with nothing and nothing to fill it with. The casualization of dock labor in Victorian London the system under which employers took on workers by the day, or even by the half day, with no commitment to future employment, was one of the most extensively documented features of Victorian poverty, and it produced exactly the kind of income instability that could drive a man from a rented room to a lodging house bunk, to a lodging house bunk, to a lodging house bunk, to a lodging house bunk house of a few of cars, with a farce of a foul, with a few bog, with a fess of bad bass of bass of back, with clubs of with for a pro belly with twif with bull with dab up kip with or with half with look but wrap with moved to with ha I got with back up Gagaft go back where ha with pog back the half cook that full of now gas at the scuffed little pepper before have go cover what's murdered assist if the speed. Mayhew interviewed dozens of such men in the course of his investigations, and his transcriptions of their words, if they are transcriptions, which is a question that historians debate, or whether they represent a degree of literary reconstruction, convey a consistent picture. A man who had once had a steady job, who had once paid his rent regularly and kept a decent room, who had once been, in his own phrase, and by his own understanding, respectable, and who had lost all of this through a combination of illness, seasonal unemployment, the failure of an employer, or simply the accumulation of small reverses that the casual labor market made almost inevitable over a long enough period. The descent from room to lodging house to rope was not, in most of these accounts, a sudden fall, but a gradual erosion, a step taken when the room could no longer be afforded, another step taken when the lodging house bunk could no longer be afforded, each step representing both a financial and a psychological threshold that required, once crossed, a recalibration of what one was and what one could expect. Among these men, the experience of illness was particularly prominent. Victorian London was a place where physical incapacitation could happen with terrible speed and with consequences. That fell almost entirely on the individual, since the social safety net that might cushion such falls simply did not exist in any meaningful form. A severe cold that laid a man up for a week could be enough to lose him his job if he was in casual employment, his room if he fell behind on rent, and his footing on the respectable side of the poverty divide if the room went and there was nothing to fall back on. Tuberculosis, the great killer of the Victorian urban poor, thriving in the damp and overcrowded conditions of the rookeries and lodging houses, was both a consequence and a cause of poverty. Men and women were more vulnerable to it because they were poor, and became poorer because it left them too weak to work. Mayhew's accounts contain numerous descriptions of men sleeping on ropes who were visibly ill, coughing through the night, running fevers, bodies wasted by malnutrition and disease, men who were caught in the final stages of the downward spiral that would end, in many cases, not in recovery and restoration, but in many cases, not in many cases in mess in caher scalp. In cows, in picaus, in calc, in kill, and in forward within, tag with cap rit in it, kin, xouse in with it in it, ta, wizard with oxat, pex, bab, the fat with Women were also present in the rope houses, though their presence is less well documented and more complex to interpret. Victorian social investigators tended to focus their attention on men when they visited establishments of this kind, partly because women's destitution had its own distinct geography: the night refuge, the Magdalen home, the network of charitable institutions specifically organized around female poverty, and partly because the presence of women in the mixed sleeping spaces of the rope house raised moral questions that Victorian journalists found difficult to address directly. When women do appear in accounts of rope houses, they tend to appear as marginal figures, the wife accompanying a destitute husband, the widow who has found herself without income or shelter after her husband's death, the young woman newly arrived in the city from the countryside or from Ireland with expectations of employment that have not been met. The Irish presence in Victorian London's destitute population was substantial and consistently noted by contemporaries. The famine years of the late 1840s had driven hundreds of thousands of Irish men and women to Britain and beyond. and London received a significant proportion of them, arriving at the docks in a state of extreme poverty and physical debilitation, speaking in many cases little English, knowing no one in the city, and having no resources beyond the strength of their bodies and the willingness to work for whatever wages were offered. They concentrated in the worst housing districts, took the most dangerous and lowest paid work, and were consistently represented in the accounts of lodging houses and rope houses at a proportion well above their share of the general population. They were also, frequently, objects of a hostility from English workers that complicated their already precarious economic position, suspected of undercutting wages, of taking work that rightly belonged to English labourers, of introducing disorder and disease into the districts where they settled. Discharged soldiers were another group that recurred in accounts of the ropehouse clientele. The Victorian British Army was in a state of almost permanent activity in India, in Africa, in the Crimea, in various colonial theatres of operation, and it regularly discharged men who had served their terms or been invalided out, sending them back to the cities they had come from with a small gratuity that rarely lasted long, and with skills and dispositions shaped by military life in ways that did not always translate smoothly into civilian employment. A man who had spent 5 or 10 years in the army, learning obedience and endurance rather than a marketable trade, and who returned to London to find that the city had no particular use for those qualities, could find himself adrift with a speed that the charitable organizations of the period, the Soldiers' Institute, struggled to address. Children occupied a special and particularly disturbing category in the ropehouse world. Victorian London had a substantial population of children who were, for various reasons, entirely without family support, orphans, children who had been abandoned, children who had run away from abusive situations, children who had simply been separated from their families by the churning mobility of the casual labor market and had not found their way back. These children lived by the same strategies as the adult street poor, selling things, running errands, begging, occasionally stealing, and they sought shelter by the same means, including the rope house, when they could raise the penny required. Contemporary accounts mention children in rope houses with a regularity that suggests it was by no means a rare occurrence, and with a discomfort that reflects the acute tension between the Victorian ideological commitment to childhood as a sacred space of innocence and protection and the daily reality of what London's streets were doing to actual children. What all of these people shared, and it is worth stating this clearly because it is sometimes obscured by the language of Victorian philanthropy, which tended to categorize the poor in terms of their moral qualities as much as their economic circumstances, was not any particular personal failing or moral deficiency, but simply the experience of being poor in a city that had no systematic mechanism for ensuring that poverty did not mean destitution. The ropehouse client was not, in the main, a person who had chosen their situation. They were a person who had arrived at their situation through the interaction of economic forces, personal misfortune, and the systematic failure of a society to provide any adequate floor beneath its poorest members. The distinction between the person who slept in a lodging house bunk and the person who slept on a rope was, in most cases, the distinction between someone who had had a slightly better run of luck in the preceding few weeks and someone who had had a slightly worse one, not a distinction of character, or of deserving, or of any of the other moral categories that the Victorians liked to deploy in thinking about the poor. This is a point that Mayhew made, with great persistence and considerable courage, against the prevailing assumptions of his time. The street people he documented were not, he insisted, a distinct and inferior order of humanity. They were people who had been placed, by circumstance, in a situation that brought out both the worst and the best of human qualities, the brutality and the solidarity, the selfishness and the generosity, the despair and the extraordinary resilience that characterizes human beings when they are stripped of every comfort and forced to rely on their own resources and the resources of those around them. Reading Mayhew's accounts today, what strikes you most forcefully is not the degradation, though the degradation is there, unflinching and documented, but the sheer human vitality of the people he describes, their humor, their intelligence, their detailed knowledge of the city and its systems, their pride in whatever skills and capacities they have pride in whatever skills and capacities they have pride in whatever skills as they have possessities. Possessity with this possessity by cessity as blessed, with this is X and sex it's but both cam and who and with the kim with command gop weapons support to with we plit the buff with saxic garpiport tap mip we have put up power aka a hut mahak out there, They were, above all, people, not types, not abstractions, not the convenient objects of charitable concern, but people, with the full weight of individual existence that word implies. Chapter 6: The Anatomy of a Night, Hour by Hour in a Rope House. It is 5:30 on a Tuesday evening in November, in the year 1855, and the light has already gone from the London sky. What little warmth the November sun provided has withdrawn with it, and the temperature is dropping towards the freezing point that this particular winter will spend several weeks achieving. On a narrow street in Whitechapel, we will not invent a name for it, but it existed, in some form, on dozens of streets in this district, and in its neighbors, a door opens at street level, below the level of the pavement, reached by a short flight of stone steps worn smooth by the passage of many feet. The door is heavy and plain, its paint long since reduced to a greyish-brown by weather and use. Above it, no sign is necessary. The people who need to know about this place already know about it. You learn where the rope houses are, the same way you learn everything else on the street, by being told, by following, by the slow accretion of knowledge that comes from living in the city's lowest registers. The man who opens the door is in his 50s, broad-shouldered, his face organized by decades of working in close proximity to destitution into an expression that is neither kind nor unkind, but simply practiced, the expression of someone who has learned to observe human suffering without being destroyed by it, which is a skill that requires the development of a particular and carefully calibrated distance. He is the keeper, and this is his establishment, and he manages it with the competence and detachment of any small businessman who knows his trade. He will take your penny or your tuppence at the door. He will count you through. He will know, by long experience, exactly how many people the room can hold before the heat becomes oppressive and the air unbreathable, and he will stop the count at that point, not out of humanitarian concern, exactly, but out of the practical knowledge that a room pushed beyond a certain density becomes less commercially viable, not more, because the customers who are turned away will find another establishment and remember it. The first arrivals of the evening are the regulars, those who have used this specific rope house often enough to have a preference about position, who know that the ropes near the door are colder but less oppressive, or that the ropes in the center of the room are warmer but more prone to the disturbances that occur when late arrivals push their way in. A man who has been here before moves with a practiced familiarity through the room, selecting his spot with the minimal deliberation of someone who has made this particular calculation many times. He drapes his coat, if he has one, more carefully over himself, not as a cover exactly, since the rope does not allow for lying down, but arranged to provide maximum insulation for the upper body while allowing the arms to rest on the cord. He tests the rope with his weight, finds it adequate, and subsides into the beginning of the long wait for morning. The room itself is low-ceilinged and deep, perhaps 40 feet from front to back, perhaps 20 feet wide. The walls are bare plaster, stained with the exhalations of many years' worth of bodies. The floor is wooden, its boards warped and separated by gaps, through which, on warmer nights, the breath of the cellar below rises damp and fungal. The ropes are strung in rows from north to south, fixed to wooden posts that have been set into the floor and braced against the ceiling beams, perhaps 8 or 10 rows, each with room for half a dozen people to stand alongside each other without touching. There is a single source of heat, a small iron stove in the corner, its flue pipe disappearing into the wall, burning coal at a rate that the keeper has calculated precisely enough to make the room marginally less cold than the exterior, not enough to constitute genuine warmth, because coal costs money, and the margin of the rope house business does not accommodate generosity in this department. There is a candle on a shelf, one candle, replaced when it burns down, replaced again by another, which throws a weak orange light across perhaps half the room, leaving the far end in a darkness that becomes absolute when the outer door is shut against the night. In this half-dark, the room fills slowly. By 7 o'clock there are perhaps 20 people present. By 8 o'clock, 30. By 9, the keeper is approaching his count and beginning to turn people away. The room by now has a character that is entirely its own. The particular thick warmth of many bodies in a confined space, The smell that is compounded of coal smoke and damp wool, and unwashed skin, and the accumulated histories of everyone who has ever slept in this room. The sounds that accumulate gradually from silence to a low continuous murmur, coughing, breathing, occasional words exchanged between neighbors. The settling of the building around them. The conversations that occur in a rope house are by the testimony of those who witnessed them. Not so different from the conversations that occur in any space where people with a shared experience of the city and its streets find themselves temporarily in close proximity. There is talk of work, where it might be found, which employers are taking on, which docks are busy and which are idle, which building sites have taken on new men and which have laid them off. There is talk of the police, which constables are lenient and which aggressive, which streets are being swept for vagrants, where the night patrols have been concentrating their attention. There is talk of food where the cheapest bread is, which of the charitable soup kitchens are operating, which churches have been distributing relief, and whether the relief is worth the conditions attached to it. There is, sometimes, humor, the dark self-aware humor of people who have decided that if they cannot escape their situation, they can at least refuse to be entirely dominated by it. Mayhew records instances of this humor with the appreciation of someone who recognizes that it serves a genuine psychological function. The joke about the rope, about the morning awakening, about the contrast between their current situation and some imagined better life, accepted and laughed at by those to whom it is told. By Ifthie's form of agency, by 10 o'clock, the serious business of the night has begun, and that business is the attempt to sleep. The conversion from wakefulness to sleep in a rope house was not, of course, a simple process. The body in an upright position does not surrender to sleep easily. It requires the active exhaustion of everything that wakefulness can offer before it concedes. But exhaustion was, among the people who used rope houses, rarely in short supply. Many of the men and women in this room have been on their feet since before dawn, walking from one potential employer to another, standing in queues at the dock gates, pushing barrows or carrying loads, or doing whatever the day's work had required of them. Their bodies are tired in the specific, total way that physical labor produces, and the body's demand for rest is powerful enough, eventually, to override the inconveniences of the rope. The sleep that comes is not the sleep of the well-housed. It is a sleep that hovers in the shallow upper registers, the half-sleep of the cat, always ready to surface at a disturbance, always slightly aware of the surrounding environment even in its deepest moments. Henry Mayhew, in what reads as a direct account of his own observation, describes the room at midnight as a place of heavy, irregular breathing, the sound of people not quite sleeping, suspended between consciousness and unconsciousness in the posture that the rope enforces. Some have their chins on their chests, some have their arms crossed on the rope in front of them, their faces turned sideways and resting on their forearms. Some stand almost upright, only the passive pressure of the rope against their chests marking their contact with the institution that is sheltering them. The night has its disturbances. A man entering late, paying his tuppence, pushing through the room to find a space, disturbing those already settled with the cold air he brings in from outside and the sounds of his arrival. A coughing fit from somewhere in the back of the room, sustained, racking, the kind of cough that suggests deep chest involvement and that the room receives with the resigned attention of those who know it, but can do nothing about it. A brief argument between two men whose spaces overlap, quickly resolved, or not resolved, but merely subsided, neither party willing to expend the energy that resolution would require. A cry from someone in the grip of a dream that their sleeping body cannot entirely separate from reality. These disturbances ripple through the room and are absorbed back into the general murmur of shallow sleep, the room returning to its uneasy equilibrium with the resilience of a body of water disturbed and then stilling. The cold deepens as the night advances and the stove's coal burns down. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the stove has been replenished once, and the keeper or his deputy has made a circuit of the room, not out of any concern for the welfare of the inhabitants, but to ensure that no one has died, which occasionally happens and which creates paperwork and inconvenience. By 4 in the morning, the room is at its coldest and its quietest, the cold having pushed even the shallow sleep of the rope house deeper, the exhaustion of the bodies having at last overcome everything else. There is something almost peaceful about the room at this hour, something that the accounts occasionally reach for and then withdraw from, uncertain whether peace is the right word for what they are describing, or whether it is a projection of the observer's desire to find something redemptive in a scene that resists easy redemption. At 5:30, the keeper or his assistant appears. The exact procedure varies. Some accounts describe the literal cutting of the rope. with a knife drawn across the cord at one end, the sudden slack sending the rows of sleepers lurching forward in a wave of involuntary awakening. Others describe a lower key procedure, the rope end unhooked from its post, allowed to drop slowly, the sleepers easing forward and downward as the support withdraws. What all accounts agree on is the result. A room full of people suddenly, simultaneously, rudely returned to consciousness, blinking, stumbling, grabbing at the air or at each other for balance, processing in the first confused seconds of awareness the fact of where they are and what this particular morning will require of them. There is no breakfast. There is no provision of any kind beyond the fact that the room, for the space of the night, kept the rain and most of the cold off their bodies. The routine is simply to leave, to gather whatever was brought in the way of possessions, to button coats and arrange rags, and shuffle back up the stone steps to the street. By 6 in the morning the room is empty. The keeper has counted his night's takings, and the process of preparation for the next evening's clientele begins. The ropes are checked for wear. The floor is swept cursorily, the stove is raked out, and the street, cold and grey in the early light, receives the night's inhabitants back into itself, sending them forward into another day in which the central question, the question that will occupy them from the moment they leave the rope house until the moment they return to it or to some other form of shelter, is the same question it was yesterday and the day before. Where will I sleep tonight, and will I have what it takes to get there? They disperse into the city. The rope house closes its doors. The morning traffic of Whitechapel builds around them, and London, that vast and glittering and terrible machine, begins another day. Chapter 7. Henry Mayhew and the journalists who bore witness. There is a particular kind of courage that belongs not to the battlefield or the operating theatre, but to the notebook. The courage of the person who walks deliberately into the places that their society has decided not to look at, and who looks anyway, and who then refuses to allow what they have seen to be softened or translated into something more comfortable before it reaches the reader. Victorian Britain produced several such people, and without them we would know almost nothing about the rope house, the lodging house, the penny hang, the workhouse, casual ward, and the dozens of other institutions and arrangements through which the city's poorest inhabitants navigated their lives. The history we have been telling in this series is, in large part, the history that these witnesses made possible. This chapter is about them, who they were, how they worked, what they found, and what their work ultimately achieved. Henry Mayhew was born in 1812, the fourth of 17 children of a London solicitor, and he spent the first several decades of his adult life as a journalist and playwright of modest success and persistent financial difficulty, a man who understood, from personal experience, something of the anxiety of money, though never the destitution that he would devote his greatest work to documenting. He was a co-founder of the magazine Punch, which he helped establish in 1841, and he wrote prolifically for the press, in the manner of the Victorian literary journalist, on a wide range of subjects and at a wide range of levels of seriousness. But it was in the autumn of 1849, when the cholera epidemic, then devastating London's poorer districts, prompted the Morning Chronicle newspaper to commission a series of investigations into the conditions of the working poor, that Mayhew found the subject that would define him. What he did was, by the standards of Victorian journalism, extraordinary in its method as well as in its scope. He did not merely visit the districts of poverty and describe what he saw, though he did that with a visual precision that owes something to his theatrical background and something to his reading of the great European novelists. He sat down with the people who lived and worked in those districts, and he listened to them talk, and he wrote down what they said. The resulting texts, hundreds of them, eventually published in the 4 volumes of London Labour and the London Poor between 1851 and 1862, are unlike almost anything else produced in the Victorian period. A vast, rambling, inconsistent, occasionally self-contradicting, but overwhelmingly vivid archive of the spoken words of people who would otherwise have left no trace in the historical record. The methodology had its limitations, and historians have debated them at length. Mayhew was not a sociologist in the modern sense. He had no systematic sampling procedure, no framework for ensuring that the voices he recorded were representative of anything beyond themselves, no particular anxiety about the degree to which his presence and his note-taking shaped the testimony he was receiving. He was a journalist, and he operated with the journalist's instincts, drawn to the striking detail, the memorable phrase, the story with a good shape. He was also a man of his time, with assumptions about class, about gender, about the causes of poverty, that modern readers will quickly identify as limiting and sometimes as actively distorting. But for all of these qualifications, the sheer quantity and quality of what he recorded, the voices of street sellers and costermongers, of dock workers and chimney sweeps, of prostitutes and petty thieves and performers, and the entire vast population of those who scraped a living from the underside of the world's wealthiest city, constitutes an achievement that has no real parallel in the social literature of the period. It's a literal literature of the period, with a literature latris literate, to put it period but cleric. But it klert gisik with kledak, with ik klik klet with hipsoft, with kaplise it hootsen, kledak with buff pat with wekta dabloxik, what pickum stab web with hapasp at passoff, beta hapa saga but wusk at attack kapels, will habits with the alkaleft, just he feel the first It was Mayhew who gave us the most detailed descriptions of the rope house, rendered with a characteristic combination of clinical precision and suppressed emotion. He visited these establishments, as he visited almost every institution of the street poor, in person, talking to the keepers, talking to the clients, sitting in the room and observing what there was to observe. His account of a rope house in the Whitechapel area, written in the early 1850s, is the fullest contemporary description we have of what these places looked and felt and smelled like, and it is the account to which all subsequent historians of the subject have returned. He noted the rows of ropes, the hunched figures, the inadequate light, the quality of the breathing in the room, the way in which the bodies of the sleepers communicated, even in their sleep, the exhaustion of people who had been fighting simply to exist for longer than anybody ought to have to fight. He noted, too, the morning routine, the cutting of the rope, the stumbling awakenings with a brevity that is more eloquent than elaboration would have been. But Mayhew was not only an observer of physical conditions, he was, more importantly, a listener to lives, and the accounts he recorded from the people who used rope houses and lodging houses and the other institutions of the street poor are remarkable for the degree to which they insist on the individuality and agency of people who were accustomed to being discussed, if they were discussed at all, as an undifferentiated mass. A man who had once been a compositor, who had lost his job through illness, who had spent 3 months descending through the levels of lodging houses to the rope, who spoke of this descent with a precise and detailed memory that suggested he had replayed it many times in the hope of identifying the point at which a different choice might have led to a different outcome. A woman who had come to London from the west of England with her husband, who had died of cholera in the epidemic of 1849, leaving her with 2 children and no income and no incumbent and no connection in the city, who had navigated to the Endeavogated in, who had navigated to have Megacrit, and Maffakenlink, and Sukunero Klinks, and it, and Sikin it, and it, in it, and it, wikin, we web, quid, it, house, where's, blouse, quip, wick, up a cup, without puberta, quick, wick, when you wear, with the tap, web, but, gasat, makop, wahata, asko, glad with co, whiskas, gafa, gaps, stuff, whiskat, stop, rest, bad proof, the six with These are the people real, named, voiced, who populate Mayhew's great work, and who prevent it from ever quite settling into the comfortable abstraction of the poor as a class. James Greenwood entered the story a decade and a half later, and his contribution was of a different kind, less comprehensive than Mayhew's, more deliberately theatrical, but in its own way equally consequential for public consciousness. Greenwood was a journalist on the staff of the Pall Mall Gazette, the reformist evening paper that under its editor Frederick Greenwood, James's brother, was becoming one of the most influential voices in the political journalism of the 1860s. In January 1866, James Greenwood spent a night in the casual ward of the Lambeth workhouse dressed as a pauper, presenting himself at the gates in the company of genuine destitute men, subjecting himself to the full procedure of the casual ward admission, and wrote about what he experienced in a series of 3 articles under the didette, under the title A Night in a Workhouse. The articles caused a sensation that, by any measure, was extraordinary for a piece of social journalism. They were reprinted across the British press, discussed in Parliament, quoted in sermons, and read with equal intensity by those who found them a damning indictment of the workhouse system, and by those who found them an exaggerated and sensational distortion. They led to a parliamentary inquiry. They contributed to a public debate about the conditions of pauper relief that would eventually result in significant legislative changes. And they introduced to a wide readership the visceral, embodied reality of what it meant to be destitute in Victorian London, the humiliations of the admission procedure, the communal bathing in water already used by a dozen other men, the coarse workhouse clothing, the mixed dormitory in which Greenwood found himself in the company of men whose conditions and conversations he described with a repelled fascination that read simultaneously as journalism and as Gothic fiction. Greenwood's method, the undercover investigation, the journalist who adopts the disguise of the subject in order to experience from the inside what could not be adequately observed from the outside, was not entirely new, but he deployed it with a skill and a timing that made it newly powerful. The undercover investigation raised, then as now, questions about honesty and representation, about what it means for a man with resources and choices to present himself as having none, about whether the experience of voluntary poverty is sufficiently like the experience of involuntary poverty to justify the comparison. But it also achieved something that the more distant, observational journalism of Mayhew's generation could not quite achieve. It placed the comfortable reader inside the institution, in the first person, and made the discomfort, however mediated, at least partly their own. Other journalists and writers contributed to the growing body of witness. John Hollingshead, who wrote a series of investigations into London's poor districts for the Morning Post in the late 1850s and early 1860s, visited rope houses and lodging houses and described them with a directness that was sometimes more unsparing than Mayhew's. George Sims, whose collection How the Poor Live appeared in 1883, brought the visual dimension explicitly into the picture, working in collaboration with the illustrator Frederick Barnard to produce images of the street poor that reached readers who might not have engaged with purely textual accounts. Jack London, the American writer, famously immersed himself in the East End of London in 1902 and published The People of the Abyss the following year, a work that, while it belongs to the end of our period rather than the middle, represents the fullest and most radical continuation of the tradition of witness journalism that Mayhew had established half a century earlier. What all of these writers shared, despite their very different methods, their different class positions, their different literary ambitions, was the conviction that visibility mattered, that the fact of public ignorance about the conditions in which tens of thousands of Londoners were living was not merely a moral failure but a practical obstacle to change, and that the journalist's or the writer's obligation was to breach that ignorance, to take what was hidden in the courts and alleys and rope houses and lodging houses of the city and bring it into the light of public view, where it could not be so easily ignored. This conviction animated their work and gave it its particular urgency, and it was not, in the long run, without effect. The journalism of Mayhew and Greenwood and Sims and the others contributed directly to the public pressure that produced the reforming legislation of the 1860s and 1870s, the philanthropic investment of the same period, and the gradual, incomplete, but real transformation of London's relationship with its poorest inhabitants that we will examine in the final chapters of this series. But their work also did something that legislation and philanthropy could not do, which was to preserve the voices and the faces and the specific irreducible humanity of the people who lived in the rope houses and the lodging houses and the workhouses of Victorian London. 2. Ensure that these people were not simply erased by time and replaced by an abstraction called the Victorian poor, but remained, to the extent that the surviving record allows, themselves. That preservation is the greatest gift that these journalists gave to us, their distant readers, and it is the foundation on which everything we have tried to do in this series ultimately rests. Without Mayhew's notebooks, without Greenwood's articles, without the investigations and the testimonies and the images that accumulated over the Victorian decades, the rope house would be a footnote, a curiosity, a strange detail. With them, it is something more important and more difficult, a window into lives that were real, into a city that was real, into a system of inequality that was real, and that demands from us not merely historical curiosity, but something closer to reckoning. Chapter 8, The Workhouse, a fate worse than the rope. To understand this, you need to understand what the Victorian workhouse actually was, not as an abstraction, but as an institution, with its specific architecture and its specific procedures and its specific philosophy. a philosophy that was, when you examine it carefully, one of the most deliberately punitive approaches to poverty ever formally adopted by a civilized government. The legal framework was the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, passed by a reforming parliament that was convinced, on the basis of a mixture of genuine administrative concern and deeply ideological economic thinking, that the existing system of poor relief, under which the parish provided outdoor relief in money or kind to the poor in their own homes, was both expensive and counterproductive. The argument of the Act's architects, chief among them the economist Nassau Sr. and the administrator Edwin Chadwick, was that generous poor relief created a disincentive to work, that if a man could receive support without working, he would prefer idleness to labor, and that this preference was corrupting not only the individual but the broader moral fabric of the laboring classes. The solution they proposed was what they called the workhouse test. Relief would henceforth be available only to those who workhouse be available, where they would live at petition, that rendered the workhouse with level etchable with level of be bettable and gredible, where they would live abate in less stay less than best and so there's as even than with us and where and with a and as and foot back good but bad with the applicant but hope mat with that Less eligibility was not a euphemism or an accident. It was an explicit policy principle, articulated clearly in the language of the Act and its associated regulations and defended by its proponents on both economic and moral grounds. The workhouse was supposed to be unpleasant. It was supposed to be a deterrent, a last resort so deeply unappealing that only those with absolutely no other option would submit to it, and that its deterrent effect would therefore encourage the able-bodied poor to find work rather than seek relief. The physical conditions of the workhouse, the coarse uniform, the restricted diet, the compulsory labor, the segregation of families were not failures of implementation, but features of design, built into the system because the system was designed to repel as well as to relieve. The workhouse casual ward was the specific department of the workhouse that dealt with the tramp and the vagrant, the person who arrived without a settled address, who might be passing through the district, or who might be one of the permanently homeless of the city, and who presented themselves at the casual ward gate in the hope of a night's shelter and a meal. The procedure for admission to the casual ward was, by consistent testimony, a powerful deterrent in itself. The applicant presented themselves at the gate, usually in the evening, and was admitted if they were admitted at all. Some wards had waiting lists even on the coldest nights, to a process that began with the confiscation of their clothes and their possessions. Their clothing was taken and replaced with workhouse uniform. Whatever money they carried, every penny, every halfpenny, was typically confiscated, though the rules on this varied by establishment. They were required to bathe in water that might or might not have been changed since the previous occupant, in conditions that James Greenwood described as among the most degrading elements of his Lambeth night. In exchange for their night's shelter and their morning meal, a portion of bread and, some establishments, a bowl of gruel, the casual ward occupant was required to perform a task of labor before they could leave the following morning. The standard tasks were stone breaking, smashing rocks with a hammer in a stone cell, or oaken picking, which involved the painful and tedious unraveling of old tarred rope into its constituent fibers, using only the fingers. These tasks were calibrated to take several hours and to be both physically demanding and deeply unpleasant, and the occupant could not leave the ward until the task was completed to the satisfaction of the workhouse master. In some establishments, the rules required a casually admitted person to remain not merely through the following morning, but through the following day as well, effectively imprisoning them for 36 hours in exchange for a single night's shelter. The segregation of families within the workhouse, the separation of husband and wife, of parent and child, was perhaps the provision that aroused the most consistent and passionate opposition from critics of the system. A man who entered the workhouse with his wife and children was not housed with them. He was directed to the men's ward, she to the women's, the children to the children's ward. They might see each other at chapel or in the exercise yard, briefly and under supervision, but the basic domestic unit of the family was dissolved the moment they crossed the workhouse threshold. This dissolution was, again, not accidental. It was part of the deterrent design, part of the calculation that the workhouse should be a place sufficiently awful to send people back to the labor market rather than allowing them to settle into dependency. But its effect on actual families, on the husband who watched his wife and children disappear into the institution's maw, on the mother separated from her children, on the children themselves, was a source of misery, so consistently documented and so forcefully articulated by contemporary observers that it eventually articulated at by contemporary, eventually can point with porfoyan, but poor and for so suprehend, in with for beginnet with up in proik, porn within it of pep with a whippers cap to have a pat whip up at a das at a hab ma at kata hapa quaff hard kaflekat a scarf kept us guess about was mask guest with guest the body to the dust bit of move burst the diet within the workhouse was, by the dietary standards of the time, adequate in its caloric provision. The workhouse was not, in the main, a place where people starved, though specific scandals of underfeeding did occur and were periodically exposed. But adequacy of calories was not the same as adequacy of sustenance in any broader sense. The workhouse diet was designed to be monotonous and joyless. Bread, gruel, broth, occasionally a small portion of meat, served at fixed times, in fixed quantities, without variation, and without the kind of pleasure or sociability that food in any human culture carries. The contrast between the workhouse table and the lodging-house kitchen, where a man might cook whatever he had managed to acquire that day, and eat it in the company of others, according to his own timing and preference, was a contrast between the institutional and the human that many found, in the end, decisive. It was this combination, the confiscation of possessions, the degrading admission procedure, the compulsory labor, the family separation, the loss of liberty and autonomy, the institutional uniformity that stripped the individual of every external marker of identity, that drove people to choose the rope house over the casual ward, even though the rope house offered not a bed but a rope, not a meal but nothing, not warmth but the bare minimum of shelter. The casual ward offered more in material terms and less in human terms, and for many of the people who faced this choice, people who had, in some cases, very little left beyond their own sense of themselves as free agents in the city, the human terms were the ones that mattered most. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham had proposed, in the late 18th century, the idea of the panopticon, a building designed so that a single observer could monitor all its inhabitants at all times, creating in those inhabitants the permanent sense of being watched, and therefore the self-regulation that surveillance produces. The workhouse, while not literally panoptic in Bentham's architectural sense, functioned according to a similar principle of total institutional control, the regulation of every aspect of the inmate's life, from their clothing to their diet to their movements to their labor, in a system designed to produce not only relief but compliance, not only shelter but submission. Against this, the rope house offered something that might seem paradoxical: more freedom. The rope house asked only for your penny. It asked nothing else of you, not your clothes, not your family, not your liberty, not your labor, not your compliance with anyone's idea of what you should be or how you should live. You paid your penny, you leaned on your rope, and when morning came, you were free to go where you chose. This freedom was cold and hungry and uncomfortable, but it was freedom, and for a very large number of Victorian Londoners, it was worth the difference. The workhouse system was not without its defenders, and it would be unfair to present it without acknowledging that its defenders had arguments worth engaging. The system did provide, for those who entered it, a guaranteed minimum of shelter, food, and medical care that the rope house and the street did not. The workhouse infirmary, which evolved over the Victorian period from a primitive sick ward into something approaching a proper medical facility, provided care for the sick poor that was not available anywhere else without payment. The workhouse school provided education for pauper children that might otherwise have been entirely absent. The workhouse, for all its cruelties, was at least a response to poverty, an organized, institutional, funded response, however badly designed and however brutally administered, whereas the rope house was a response only to the market demand created by poverty, with no pretension to addressing the underlying condition. But the response it constituted was, as a growing chorus of critics throughout the Victorian period insisted, not merely inadequate, but actively harmful, a response that punished poverty rather than addressing it, that treated destitution as a moral failing rather than a social condition, that designed its institutions not to help people, but to deter them from needing help. The great debate about the poor law and the workhouse that ran through Victorian political culture from the 1840s to the end of the century was ultimately a debate about exactly this question, about whether poverty was a personal failure or a systemic one, about whether the poor deserved punishment or assistance, about what a society owed to its least fortunate members. The rope house sat at the center of that debate, not as a participant but as a piece of evidence, evidence of what it looked like when a city left the answer to that question entirely to the market. Chapter 9, Children of the Street, the Youngest Sleepers. There is a photograph taken by the social reformer and philanthropist Thomas John Bernardo in the 1870s that has become one of the most reproduced images of Victorian poverty. It shows a group of boys, the eldest perhaps 14, the youngest perhaps 8, huddled together in a narrow alleyway in the East End of London. They are dressed in rags. Their faces are thin and alert in the way that the faces of children who have learned to read their environment very carefully for signs of danger tend to be. They are sleeping, or trying to sleep, in the open, pressed together for warmth in the angle of a wall, their arms around each other in the unconscious solidarity of shared cold. Bernardo used this and similar photographs as fundraising tools for his campaign to establish homes for destitute children. And they were effective. They generated donations. They generated press attention. They generated parliamentary debate. They also generated controversy. It was later established that some of Bernardo's photographs were posed, children dressed in more ragged clothing than they actually wore, and arranged in tableaux of destitution, more vivid than their actual circumstances. But the debate about their authenticity, which preoccupied contemporaries and has continued to interest historians, somewhat misses the point. The conditions they depicted, children sleeping in the streets and alleys of Victorian London, were entirely real. The camera's arrangement of the specific image was the fabrication. The underlying reality was not. Victorian London had tens of thousands of homeless children. The estimates given by contemporary observers vary enormously, partly because no systematic count was ever conducted, partly because the boundaries of the category were genuinely unclear. What counted as a homeless child? The child who slept every night in the open, without any adult supervision or family connection? Or also the child who had a mother but whose mother was herself so destitute that the home they shared was a corner of a rope house floor? Or the child who worked on the street during the day and slept at the lodging house or the rope house with the money earned, in an independence that was simultaneously a survival strategy and a form of abandonment? Victorian social investigators tended to use the term street Arab, a phrase that now reads as offensive in its racial overtones, but that was deployed by contemporaries with a meaning that was primarily geographic and social. Children who lived on the street, who had made the street their primary habitat, who had developed the street's own culture and codes and survival strategies, and who were as foreign, to the eyes of respectable observers, as any traveler from an exotic land. The ways in which children came to be in this situation were various. Orphanhood was one. The Victorian city produced orphans in enormous quantities, through the diseases that killed adults at ages that left their children without support, through the industrial accidents that took fathers, through the complications of childbirth that took mothers. But orphanhood alone does not explain the scale of child homelessness, because Victorian society had, in theory, institutional responses to orphanhood: the workhouse, the orphan asylum, the charitable home. The children who ended up on the street were often not literally parentless, but effectively parentless. Children whose parents were too ill, too drunk, too overwhelmed by their own poverty, or too simply absent to provide the care and shelter that the word parent implies. They were children who had run away from situations that were intolerable, from violent or abusive family circumstances, from the workhouse itself, which many children fled at the first opportunity, and who had discovered that the street offered a degree of freedom and self-determination that the institutions designed to contain them did not. What these children did to survive is one of the great stories of Victorian social history, and it is a story of extraordinary resourcefulness and ingenuity applied in conditions of extreme adversity. The street economy of Victorian London offered a surprising range of opportunities for children willing and able to exploit them. Crossing sweeping, maintaining a clear path across a street intersection through the continual traffic of horse dung and mud, in exchange for the pennies and halfpennies of pedestrians grateful to cross without ruining their shoes or their skirts, was one of the most common occupations, requiring nothing more than a broom and a willingness to stand in the cold for hours. Henry Mayhew interviewed dozens of crossing sweepers, many of them children, and found among them a microcosm of the street economy in miniature: the territories, the negotiations over pitch, the strategies for maximizing income, the solidarity and the rivalry. Mudlarking, scavenging along the banks of the Thames at low tide for items of value washed down by the river, was another occupation that attracted significant numbers of children, drawn to the riverbank in the grey early mornings when the tide retreated and the mud exposed whatever it had been hiding. The items found by mudlarks ranged from lumps of coal dropped from the barges that worked the river, to pieces of rope and metal that could be sold to marine dealers, to the occasional coin or small object of greater value that had found its way into the water from the crowded streets above. It was cold, filthy, physically demanding work, conducted in mud that could swallow a child to the knees, and in the shadow of the great ships and wharves of the world's busiest river port. But it required no capital, no tools, no patronage, no adult permission, and it could produce enough on a good day for a meal and a night's shelter. Match selling, flower selling, the sale of watercress gathered from the market gardens to the north of the city, the running of errands for businesses and traders who found the small, fast figures of street children useful for the rapid communication of messages across the city's crowded streets. These were some of the other occupations through which the children of the streets sustained themselves. They were occupations that generated, on a good day, a few pence, enough, perhaps, for a meal and a penny for the rope house, or for a bed in one of the lodging houses that admitted children. On a bad day, they generated nothing, and on a bad day the child faced the options available to every destitute person in the city: the charitable night refuge, the workhouse, casual ward, the rope house, or the open street. The rope house was, by various accounts, used by children who were old enough and bold enough to present themselves at the door and pay their penny. Mayhew's investigations record the presence of children in rope houses, though he is careful not to make this seem routine in a way that might suggest that it was an acceptable or adequate provision for a child of 10 or 12, spending the night on a rope in the company of adult men and women of every description, many of them drunk, some of them criminal, all of them operating under the norms and rules of the street, rather than any of the norms that Victorian ideology assigned to the world of childhood, was an experience that struck contemporary observers as a concentrated expression of everything that was wrong with the city's treatment of its youngest and most vulnerable inhabitants. Thomas Bernardo arrived in London in 1866 as a young medical student from Dublin, intending to train as a doctor before going as a missionary to China. What he found in the East End changed his plans entirely. Walking the streets of Stepney and Whitechapel, he encountered the reality of child homelessness with an immediacy that he later described as transformative: children sleeping in barrels and under market stalls, and in the arches beneath the railway viaducts that were then being built across the East End. Children in conditions of destitution that he found impossible to reconcile with any version of Christianity that treated the protection of the vulnerable as a central obligation. The story he told of a boy now at Slonch, the central obsecide, the central obliesli at the central of the underlying myths tend, the lounging myth slide attend of a ploughed, and encounter and encounting, and encounting and enkending, and in its slunts pleninsley, and unclinden pen, in it blah, in its all, with a clear pack in, and it will have pat wind well, how to spring that look, kupata, where buff, where I buff sack with quick, where I could, breath hop up with the ark up, I past up to the half, look set up, I got like I pass kakasta, walks sack bow, I my school where there, mif no, I was guessed, goats, so if bust will, if Mikaos, bust do, so go, wolfsicles, Bernardo's response was the establishment of what he called ragged schools, educational establishments that admitted children regardless of their state of dress or cleanliness, in explicit defiance of the conventions of the regular school system. And then, from 1870 onwards, the homes for destitute boys and girls that became the institution most closely associated with his name. The homes were not without controversy. They were large, institutional, paternalistic, organized on the assumption that the children who entered them needed to be reshaped from the ground up into a version of themselves that respectable society could recognize and accept. And this assumption involved a degree of cultural violence towards the children's own identities that later critics were right to identify and challenge. But they were also genuinely effective at removing children from the street and providing them with food, shelter, education, and the beginnings of a path towards something other than the ropehouse. Something other than the ropehouse. Houthstel, watch war port, war plus horde, warwart, war with war. Ward, or war, cat, or what with the war, or with wick, with breath, or wolf, will that war wick, with that forward wolf, with all south, with gamic hop up with wolves, with it, with what with a pack, more at art, up or father, fast off, wask, would have wask, auch go with fluff, cat the dog, fought if the woman of gus, that is that was war, what widows, just read, he differs the kiss, goes of. The clever would look to the clever Bernardo was far from alone in this work. The Shaftesbury Society, the Waifs and Strays Society, later the Church of England Children's Society, the various Catholic charities, the Jewish Board of Guardians, all were doing similar work, in various forms and with various philosophies, across the second half of the Victorian period. The Ragged School movement, which had begun in the 1840s under the encouragement of Lord Shaftesbury, and which eventually federated into the Ragged School Union, operated hundreds of schools in the poorest districts of London and other cities, providing free basic education to children who would otherwise have had none. These schools were the direct predecessors of the board schools established under the Education Act of 1870, which made elementary education both universally at APT, changed the prospication of a planche of Trajan of a charitable and a charity of electrication of Trajan, changing the planche of changing batch in persecution bad in for the same with can't expel, forcing in with buff cat win with and will awkward with hun, with into and gone be it however with so we could to have to whip a cat with bad up with bad at a cap will go out met what a work happy to purpose start that of cock what let you get a screw our bites to it's good to who's the good list past to for the for good still is good you code to the first step Education was not, by itself, enough to solve the problem of child homelessness. A child who attended a ragged school during the day still needed somewhere to sleep at night, but it was a beginning, and it was a beginning that rested on a philosophical shift of real significance. The Education Act implicitly asserted that children had rights, that the state was obliged to protect, that a child's development was not merely a private matter between the child and their family, or a charitable matter between the child and those wealthy enough to help, but a public concern that government had a responsibility to address. That assertion, once made, had implications that extended beyond education, and it was one of the foundations on which the later development of child welfare legislation, the Children's Charter of 1889, the Children Act of 1908, was eventually built. By the end of the Victorian era, the street Arab was a less visible figure than he had been at its beginning, not because child homelessness had been eliminated, but because the combination of compulsory education, expanded charitable provision, improved municipal housing, and a gradually developing sense of collective responsibility towards children had reduced its scale and moved much of its remaining reality behind institutional doors. The rope house was still there, for those adults who needed it, but fewer children were sleeping on its ropes. It was progress, of a kind, slow, partial, contested, often inadequate, but real. And it had been made possible, in significant part, by the journalists and the philanthropists and the reformers who had refused to let the children of the street remain invisible. Chapter 10: Reform, Religion, and the Shelter Movement. By the 1860s and 1870s, a particular kind of discomfort was spreading through the more thoughtful sections of Victorian society, a discomfort that was not merely aesthetic or sentimental, but increasingly moral and, in some quarters, political. The journalism of Mayhew and his successors had made the conditions of the rope house and the lodging house and the street visible to an educated readership that was, by and large, genuinely disturbed by what it was reading. The cholera epidemics of 1832, 1848, and 1866 had demonstrated, with a directness that no amount of ideological argument could easily deflect, that the living conditions of the poor were not merely a problem for the poor, but a public health threat to everyone. That disease did not respect the boundary between the courts of Whitechapel and the drawing rooms of Mayfair in the way that the Victorian class system liked to imagine, and the investigative journalism of the 1860s, Greenwood's Workhouse Night, the various exposes of lodging-house conditions, the increasingly explicit accounts of child destitution, had created a public pressure that the political system was beginning to feel. Into this moment of discomfort and pressure stepped a diverse coalition of reformers, philanthropists, clergy, and social activists who had, in common, the conviction that the current situation was intolerable and that voluntary action, rather than or in addition to, state intervention was both possible and necessary. Their responses took many forms, ranging from the provision of cheap food and shelter through commercial or semi-commercial enterprises to the establishment of model housing. From the organization of night refuges to the development of the evangelical work among the poor that would eventually culminate in the formation of the Salvation Army. What they shared was the determination to do something, to move from the documentation of suffering to its alleviation, from witness to action. The Society for Improving the Condition of the Laboring Classes had been founded as early as 1844, with Prince Albert as its patron and a membership that included some of the most prominent reforming figures of the mid-Victorian period. Its primary intervention was the promotion of what it called model dwellings, purpose-built housing for the working poor, designed to provide decent accommodation at rents that working people could afford, demonstrating by example that decent housing and commercial viability were not incompatible. The Society's buildings were not, by modern standards, generous in their provision. The rooms were small, the facilities shared, the rules for tenants numerous and strictly enforced, but they represented a genuine advance on the rookeries and subdivided houses that most of their tenants had previously inhabited, and they established a model that other philanthropic housing organizations would follow and develop throughout the rest of the century. The Peabody Trust, established in 1862 with an endowment from the American financier and philanthropist George Peabody, was the most significant of these successor organizations. Peabody donated the then enormous sum of £500,000, subsequently increased to more than £500,000 for the purpose of ameliorating the condition and augmenting the comforts of the poor of London. The Trust used these funds to construct large blocks of model dwellings in the poorest districts of the city, blocks that still stand in many parts of London today, their plain brick facades and utilitarian courtyards recognizable wherever they appear. By the 1880s, the Peabody Trust was housing many thousands of Londoners in accommodation that was, by the standards of what it replaced, genuinely decent, clean, ventilated, equipped with running water and sanitary facilities, maintained in a state of repair that the private lodging market made no pretension to achieving. But the model dwellings, important as they were, did not directly address the problem of the rope house and the street, because they were not aimed at the very poor. Their rents, though subsidized by philanthropic endowment, were still beyond the reach of the casual laborer or the person with no regular income, and their rules, requiring proof of regular employment, good character references, sobriety, explicitly excluded the population that most needed housing. There were improvements for the respectable working poor, not solutions for the destitute. The gap between what model dwellings offered and what the rope house clientele needed remained as wide as ever. It was this gap that the Salvation Army, more than any other single organization, attempted to address directly. The Army had been founded by William Booth in 1865 as the East London Christian Mission, a revival organization specifically targeting the urban poor, operating in tent meetings and adapted buildings in the streets of Whitechapel and Mile End, seeking to bring evangelical Christianity to people who had been entirely untouched by the established church. In 1878 it reorganized itself as the Salvation Army, with a military structure and a military vocabulary that proved enormously effective in generating discipline, loyalty, and the kind of vivid public presence that attracted both donations and new converts. By the 1880s it was operating across Britain and beginning to expand internationally, and William Booth had begun to develop the social program, the Darkest England program as he called it, after the title of his 1890 book In Darkest England and the Way Out, that would eventually make the Salvation Army one of the major providers of social services to the destitute in the English-speaking world. The Salvation Army's response to the Rope House was the cheap shelter, an establishment that occupied the same market niche as the Rope House, but that offered something categorically different: a place to lie down, a meal, Christian fellowship, and a degree of personal engagement from staff who were trained not merely to manage the destitute, but to relate to them as fellow human beings with souls in need of saving as well as bodies in need of shelter. The Army's shelters were not luxurious. They were large, bare, institutional spaces, their sleeping accommodation consisting of rows of simple wooden bunks or narrow beds, their food basic and wholesome but not plentiful. But they offered horizontal rest, and they offered it for a price, 1 penny, or 2pence, or in some cases nothing at all, for those who could not pay. That put them in direct competition with the Rope House. The Salvation Army's approach to this work was shaped by its theology and its organizational culture in ways that distinguished it from the more purely charitable or housing-focused interventions of other organizations. Booth and his officers believed that the material and the spiritual were inseparable, that you could not address the soul without addressing the body, and could not address the body without also addressing the soul. And this belief produced a model of engagement with the destitute that was, at its best, more holistic and more humanizing than the purely institutional responses of the workhouse or the model lodging house. The army officer who greeted a man at the shelter door was supposed to know his name, to remember his history from one visit to the next, to see him as an individual rather than an occupant of a space. Whether this ideal was consistently achieved in practice is a question that the historical record cannot fully answer, but it represented an aspiration that was different in kind from the cold commercial transaction of the Rope House and the cold bureaucratic transaction of the workhouse. William Booth's In Darkest England and the Way Out, published in 1890, was one of the most widely read and debated works of social analysis of the late Victorian period. Its central argument, that the condition of the very poor in Britain was equivalent in its degradation and its hopelessness to the condition of the inhabitants of the unexplored interior of Africa, as described in H.M. Stanley's contemporary accounts, was deliberately provocative, deploying the language of the missionary and the imperialist to argue that the streets of London required rescue and transformation as urgently as any foreign field. The book proposed a comprehensive program of social intervention: farm colonies where the urban destitute could be retrained for agricultural work, emigration schemes that would move the surplus poor to the colonies, and a network of city shelters and food depots, relief without which any longer-term intervention was meaningless. Some of these proposals were, in retrospect, as problematic as they were visionary. The enthusiasm for emigration as a solution to urban poverty reflected assumptions about the colonies and their inhabitants that the 21st century cannot view without discomfort. But the shelters and food depots were built and operated, and they made a direct and measurable difference to the conditions of the people who used them. The Church of England, the Catholic Church, the various nonconformist denominations, the Jewish community, all contributed to the growing infrastructure of charitable provision for the destitute poor through the last decades of the Victorian era. Night refuges, soup kitchens, clothing distribution centers, employment registries, temperance hotels that provided cheap accommodation to those attempting to avoid the public house. These multiplied across London's poorest districts in a profusion that reflected both the scale of the need and the growing sense among the organized religious and charitable communities that the need could not be addressed by faith alone, but required the direct provision of material resources. This grievously the destitute of destitute, this grievoustud that brotitude, detuded bottifling, cobius, the destitute corritude, captivated, caritatu parody of bordivac, to be pretty and be pretty and be teared ball with tin birit to retur titin cry plea kakan were in biv or back and wood and a war and with an on with a war we were all call we with our for with a pure silk turt oh squith going with with ghost with up a hop cat papa will put up the pocket up this house how the gas sacks was. The intersection of religion and reform in this period was not without its tensions and contradictions. The evangelical insistence on personal conversion as the prerequisite or the accompaniment of material relief created situations in which the hungry were required to sit through a sermon before they could eat, a condition that many of those who needed the food found deeply objectionable, and that the more secular reformers of the period criticized as an abuse of charitable power. The assumption widespread among religious charitable workers that destitution was in large part a product of personal moral failing, drink, idleness, improvidence, and that the remedy therefore required moral reformation as much as material relief, was an assumption that sat uneasily alongside the structural analyses that Mayhew and others had been developing, and that sometimes led to interventions that blamed the victim while purporting to help them. These tensions were real, and they persisted throughout the period and beyond it. But they did not prevent the shelter movement from doing work that was genuinely valuable, and that was, in the long run, more important than the rope house, precisely because it represented an alternative to it, an alternative that said, however imperfectly, that the destitute deserved something better than a rope. Chapter 11: The End of the Rope. Victorian London's slow transformation. Nothing in Victorian social history happened quickly, and nothing happened cleanly. The transformation of London's relationship with its poorest inhabitants, the slow, contested, partial process by which the rope house was rendered obsolete, and the conditions that had made it necessary were, if not eliminated, then at least significantly ameliorated, was not the result of a single decisive act or a single enlightened policy, but of the accumulation, over several decades, of dozens of overlapping interventions, legislative, philanthropic, journalistic, municipal, and eventually political, in the deepest sense of a shift in what the public and its elected representatives were willing to accept. The legislative strand begins, for our purposes, with the Public Health Act of 1848, a measure prompted by the cholera epidemic of that year, and by the 50 investigations of Edwin Chadwick, whose 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population had documented, with statistical thoroughness, the relationship between the living conditions of the poor and their mortality rates. The Act established a General Board of Health with powers to compel local authorities to improve sanitation, provide clean water, and address the drainage systems that were allowing the city's waste to contaminate its water supply. It was imperfect and inadequate in its immediate effects. Local resistance to its provisions was fierce, and the Board of Health itself was abolished in 1858, but it established the principle of state responsibility for public health that would eventually produce the comprehensive sewerage system designed by Joseph Bazalgette in the 1860s, the single greatest feat of Victorian civil engineering, and the intervention that, more than any other, reduced the death rate from infectious disease in London's poorest districts. The Lodging Houses Acts of 1851 and subsequent years, which we have already discussed, represented the first attempt to regulate the conditions of the commercial sleeping market directly, to impose minimum standards on the doss, houses and rope houses of the city, and to give local authorities the powers to inspect and, if necessary, close establishments that fell below those standards. Their implementation was variable, and their impact on the worst establishments limited, but they established a framework of regulation that had not previously existed, and that provided the basis for more effective action as the century advanced, and as local government became better resourced and more willing to use its powers. The Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act of 1875, the Cross Act, as it was known after its sponsor, the Home Secretary Richard Cross, was perhaps the most significant single piece of housing legislation of the Victorian period. It empowered local authorities to compulsorily purchase and demolish areas of slum housing, the unhealthy areas in the language of the Act, and to sell the cleared land to charitable or commercial developers for the construction of new working-class housing. The Act was used by the Metropolitan Board of Works, London's pre-municipal governing body, to clear several of the worst rookeries that had survived into the 1870s, the Old Nickel in Bethnal Green, areas of Clerkenwell, portions of Southwark and Bermondsey, and to replace them, in theory, with model dwellings at rents that working people could afford. In practice, the Cross Act was less transformative than its advocates had hoped. The clearances it enabled did destroy some of the worst slum housing in the city, but the replacement housing was typically built at rents, even with philanthropic subsidy, that were beyond the reach of those most in need of housing, the casual poor, the rope house clientele. Clearing a slum and building model dwellings in its place did not rehouse the slum's former inhabitants. It displaced them into adjacent districts, often making overcrowding in those districts worse, while the new buildings were taken up by the slightly more prosperous section of the working class. The pattern of gentrification without displacement, in which slum clearance improved conditions for the better-off working class, while simply moving the worst poverty elsewhere, was identified by social investigators of the period, notably by Octavia Hill and later by Charles Booth, and became a persistent critique of the Across Act and its successors. Charles Booth's great survey, Life and Labour of the People in London, published in 17 volumes between 1889 and 1903, was to the late Victorian period what Mayhew's work had been to the mid-Victorian, a comprehensive, painstaking, statistically rigorous attempt to map the geography of London poverty and to understand its causes and its scale. Booth, a Liverpool shipowner, who brought to social investigation the same systematic habits of mind that he applied to his business, employed a team of researchers who spent years walking the streets of London, district by district, interviewing school board visitors and police constables and charitable workers and the poor themselves, and assembling the results into a series of coloured maps. The series of coloured maps, the visual of textual's description, the visual descriptions of placage, the textual descriptions of textual. This question of previously, questions, it is a preview, and a kissable, and a kifferable graphics can be scrisictions at a grin with kin it's in primpen, a frag, go hats of Wissel, however, will our Beth we spoke, what become with art, but how what the lapel pass. With what I say, as you skis this always asked go ask what's to was how feast Triticus was good was this Booth's findings that approximately 30% of London's population was living below the poverty line as he defined it. That poverty of this scale was structural rather than personal in its origins. That the residuum of the chronically destitute could not be separated from the condition of casual labor that created and perpetually reproduced it, had an impact on political thought that went well beyond the immediate sphere of housing or social welfare. They contributed to the intellectual formation of the generation of liberal politicians, Lloyd George, Churchill, Asquith, who would, in the first decade of the 20th century, introduce the Old Age Pensions Act, the National Insurance Act, and the other foundational measures of what would eventually become the welfare state. Booth's maps were, in a very direct sense, one of the intellectual foundations on which the 20th century's response to poverty was built. The London County Council, established by the Local Government Act of 1888, was the first truly democratic governing body for the metropolitan area, replacing the Metropolitan Board of Works with an elected council that was from its first years dominated by the Progressive Party, a liberal Labour coalition that was genuinely committed to using municipal power to improve the conditions of the city's poorest inhabitants. The LCC built housing directly. The Boundary Estate in Bethnal Green, opened in 1900 on the site of the cleared old nickel slum, was the first large-scale municipal housing project in Britain and used its regulatory powers more aggressively than its predecessors to enforce standards in the private rental market and in the commercial sleeping establishments that still served at the destitute. By the turn of the 20th century, the rope house as a distinct institution was becoming rare, not because the poverty that had created it had been eliminated, but because the combination of regulatory pressure, philanthropic provision, and gradually improving wages and working conditions in the years of late Victorian economic growth had reduced the number of people for whom the rope was the only option available. The Salvation Army's shelters, the LCC's model dwellings, the expanded provision of the charitable organizations, and the beginnings of what would eventually become a public housing program had created, for the first time, a range of alternatives that covered, however imperfectly and incompletely, the territory that the rope house had once occupied alone. The rope house did not disappear overnight. Some establishments continued to operate into the Edwardian period, documented by later envisioning the Biscaymet Guinea and Iskimidid, documentation with imcessibrets, inspirations, inserwoods being excretioning in scans, its clinis plus in scanciusitins chimis scansen skintix and its pumens imxan mechanics exiprinits imsen again a accept it and it if whips work clock while wick ak with half car code with at The transformation was real, but it should not be overstated. When Jack London visited the East End in 1902 and wrote The People of the Abyss, he found conditions that would have been recognizable to Mayhew: the same casual labor market, the same overcrowded lodging houses, the same rough sleepers under the arches of the Thames bridges. When the social investigator B.C. Beaumont-Rontry conducted his survey of poverty in York in 1901, he found that approximately 28% of the city's population was living in poverty, a figure remarkably close to Booth's London estimate of 30%, suggesting that the conditions Booth had documented were not specific to the capital, but characteristic of the industrial city more generally. The rope house was going, but the poverty that had made it was not. That poverty was being managed differently, more humanely, more institutionally, with a greater degree of state involvement and a greater recognition of collective responsibility, but it was not being eliminated. That elimination would require the 20th century and its very different politics. But the Victorian period had built the foundations, imperfect and contested as they were, on which the 20th century would build. Chapter 12, The Long Sleep. What Victorian poverty tells us about our own world. There is a temptation, at the end of a history like this one, to reach for the consolation of progress, to note how far we have come, to celebrate the distance between the rope house of 1850 and the social welfare systems of the 21st century, and to find in that distance the reassurance that humanity learns and improves, and that the arc of history bends, however slowly, towards something better. The temptation is understandable. The distance is real. The progress is real. There is no equivalent, in any developed nation today, of the commercial rope house. No establishment where a person pays a penny to lean on a cord and call it a night's sleep. The institutional architecture of the welfare state, the social security systems, the public housing programs, the health services, the night shelters and hostels, represents an accumulation of political will and public investment that would have seemed utopian to the most optimistic Victorian reformer. But the temptation should be resisted, or at least approached with care, because history that serves only as a vehicle for self-congratulation is history that has ceased to do its most important work. The rope house did not exist because the Victorians were uniquely cruel or uniquely indifferent. It existed because a particular economic system, one organized around the market allocation of resources, the casualization of labor, and the minimal involvement of the state in the provision of basic needs, produced, as a natural and predictable consequence, a population of people for whom the market's minimum offering was a rope. The question that the rope house puts to us is not how different are we from the Victorians, but how different are the systems we have built, and how much of the progress we have made is secure. The answer, when you look at it honestly, is more complicated than the self-congratulatory narrative allows. Rough sleeping, the modern equivalent of the Victorian person who could not afford even the rope house, has been rising in Britain, the United States, and many other developed countries for the past decade and more. The figures from England are stark. Rough sleeping doubled between 2010 and 2017, before the pandemic, and while it fell during the pandemic, when emergency measures housed many of those sleeping rough in hotels and temporary accommodation, it has risen again since the waiting lists for social housing in England run to more than 1 million households. The hostile system that serves as the modern equivalent of the common lodging house is under sustained pressure from reduced funding and rising demand. The relationship between the loss of a job, the loss of income, and the loss of a home is, for people at the bottom of the housing market, as immediate and as brutal as it was for the casual labourer of Victorian London. The specific mechanisms are different. The institutions have changed. The language has changed. Nobody today sleeps on a rope, or if they do, it is not as a commercially organized institution but as a personal improvisation of a different kind. But the underlying condition, the existence of a class of people who are too poor to access the private housing market, and for whom the state's provision is inadequate to cover the gap, is not a Victorian curiosity. It is a contemporary reality. The question of where the poorest people in a city sleep tonight is not a historical question. It is a question being asked, and inadequately answered, in London and New York and Paris and Sydney and Mumbai and every other major city in the world at this present moment. The Victorian social investigators understood, at their best, that poverty was not an individual condition, but a social one, that it was produced by systems, maintained by systems, and could only be adequately addressed by changing systems. Mayhew understood it. Booth understood it. William Booth understood it, in his way. The reformers who pushed for the Housing Acts, and the Factory Acts, and the Education Act, and the beginnings of social insurance, understood it. The 20th century acted on that understanding, imperfectly and incompletely, to build the welfare state. The 21st century has been, in many developed nations, in the process of partially dismantling what the 20th century built, not always deliberately, not always with full awareness of what is being undone, but measurably and consequentially. The rope house reminds us what happens when the systems fail, when the market is left to provide what only solidarity can adequately supply. It reminds us not as an abstraction, but as a human reality. The man bending his back over the cord, the woman pulling her coat closer against the cold of the room, the child pressed against the adult stranger for warmth. These were not allegorical figures. They were people, with the full weight of individual existence, people who had names and histories, and specific memories of better times, and specific fears about the morning. Their existence in those conditions was not inevitable. It was the product of choices, political choices, economic choices, social choices, made by people who had the power to make them, and who were responsible for their consequences. We have that power too. The choices are different now, but the structure of the situation is not so different that the Victorian experience has nothing to teach us. Every generation that has addressed the problem of extreme urban poverty has begun by making it visible, by insisting that the people who sleep on ropes, or in doorways, or in overcrowded hostels are not invisible, are not a category, are not a problem to be managed at minimum cost, but people whose claims on the rest of their society are real and urgent and non-negotiable. Mayhew's greatest achievement was not statistical, it was moral. He sat down with people whom his society had decided were not worth sitting down with, and he listened to them, and he wrote down what they said, and he insisted that his readers attend to it. That insistence, the insistence on visibility, on the particularity of individual lives within the larger structures of poverty, on the moral seriousness of the question of where the poorest people in your city sleep tonight, is the lasting gift of the rope house to history, not as a horror story, not as a Victorian curiosity, not as evidence of how far we have progressed, but as a question, still open, still unanswered, still requiring from each generation the courage to look directly at what their economic arrangements produce for those at the bottom, and to decide whether that production is acceptable. The rope house is gone. The question it embodied is not. Close your eyes now. The fog has settled over the Thames. The gas lamps have gone out, one by one, and the city breathes slowly in the dark. In a narrow room in Whitechapel, a man leans forward onto a rope, stretched taut across a room, and feels, with the whole exhausted weight of his body, the small and temporary relief of something to lean on. He is part of history now. But history is not finished with him yet, because the question he embodies, the question of what a city owes to those who cannot find their own answer to the simplest of human needs, is the question that every generation has to answer for itself. Tonight is your generation's night to answer it. Sleep well.